Hello and welcome to the fifth and final instalment of George's Marvellous Medicine. If you remember where we left off at the end of the last chapter, we saw Mr. Cranky, George's father, who got super excited because remember he saw what George's Marvellous Medicine had done to all his farmyard animals and made them huge. And he was really keen to find out how George made it, so with the intention that they might be able to sell it to all the farmers around the world. And we're going to move on. So the next chapter is called Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Killicranky. "Which one did you put in first?" This one," George said. "Golden Gloss hair shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now, what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he'd used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute. I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work. At least, not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." I think someone mentioned on the last comment about the shoe polish, but it was a brown quart of paint. Close though. Mr. Killicranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George, dip a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon and we'll give some to a chicken, just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvellous Medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of the Marvellous Medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers, looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went, peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on the chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1. But it was interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killicranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sated aunts!" cried Mr. Killiecranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know. You left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" I appreciate that's quite bright. So if I hold it a bit closer, can you see? There is George and Mr. Cranky peering up at this enormous chicken. Or rather, the chicken's not particularly big, but his legs are really, really long, aren't they? I don't think that's going to be particularly popular with people, is it? Okay. "I've got it," said George. "What is it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "So you're right, Mrs. Mann, you were right." Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Next chapter is called Marvellous Medicine number 3. "Here it is," cried Mr. Killiecranky, rushing into the kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish." George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I'll bet we've got it." After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a couple of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I hope you do better than last time," said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken," said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. "Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went, "Peck." "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. "Watch him now," cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." Mr. Killiecranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky said. "It's getting longer," George said. "I'll say it's getting longer," Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. "Last time it was the legs," Mrs. Cranky said. "Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken with a long neck." It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. Oh my goodness, it looks very silly, doesn't it? "All right, George," Mr. Cranky said. "What else have you forgotten?" "I don't know, Dad," George said. "Oh, yes, you do," Mr. Cranky said. "Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember it." "I put in some engine oil from the garage," George said. "Did you have that on your list?" "Eureka!" cried Mr. Cranky. "That's the answer. How much did you put in?" "Half a pint," George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. "And some antifreeze," George called after him. "I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze." The next chapter, Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. "Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same thing, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of those things. And how can you possibly do that?" You keep out... Sorry. You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's marvellous medicine number 4, and when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You've got to have some more mighty queer chickens around here if you're going to like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give him a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with a new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. Come on. The brown hen walked over, looked at the spoon, then it went peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Okay, the next chapter. Goodbye, Grandma. Oops. Here we go. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked all forlorn. It means he looked really sad. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cupful of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho-ho, she cried, ha-ha! So, that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself, all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring me one of your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't... Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it to me, this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge, horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's around here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. So I'm not sure if you can see that. Let me put the book down. So here we have her drinking what she thinks is tea, but we know is George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And now, let me hold it up. You can see steam coming out of her ears. I wonder what's going to happen. Is she going to get bigger? Shall we find out? Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's left out a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police. Man the hose pipes. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma! Shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped, and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Look, so the steam's about to stop. And look, she's shrunk. She's now the same height as Mrs. Cranky. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to a normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. Look, Mrs. Cranky's now looking down on her. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than the little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? You're still going, shouted You're still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end and pull, Mr. Cranky said. But then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then a tiny little dot, then there was nothing at all. Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime, she was saying, Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, said Mr. Cranky. She most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched, with the very tips of his fingers, the edge of a magic world. And that is the end of the story. It's a fantastic story, isn't it? Mr. Cranky's funny, isn't it? You'd think he'd be a little bit sad that his mother-in-law's no longer in the house, but if she'd been that nasty and miserable, do you think you'd miss someone like that if they were living with you? I hope you enjoyed that, guys. We will have another story for you tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.